What is the worst thing you've seen hidden in the fine print of a contract? Story 1. I once negotiated a commercial lease for a retail space in a prestigious outdoor shopping mall. The mall was known for attracting high-end retailers and provided a prime location for businesses. As part of the negotiation process, I had to carefully review all the terms and conditions to ensure that the lease agreement would protect my client's interests. One particular clause stood out as highly unusual and potentially problematic. The lease stipulated that if at any point the tenant decided to vacate the space or did not renew their lease, the mall owner would have the right to continue using the tenant's trademark for a new business in that same space. Essentially, this meant that if my client, a recognizable retail brand, chose to leave, the mall owner could then open a new store in the same location under the original brand's name, even though it was no longer associated with the original company. For example, if a well-known jewelry retailer like Pandora decided to open a store in the mall and later moved out, the mall owner could then open another store in the same location using the Pandora trademark. This meant that the mall owner could legally use the established brand's name, logo, and reputation without having any affiliation with the actual company. The new business operating under the former tenant's brand could be entirely different in terms of quality, products, or customer service, but customers would believe it to be the same brand they were familiar with. This clause raised significant concerns for the tenant, as it had the potential to damage the brand's reputation and cause confusion among customers. It also opened the door for the mall owner to exploit the goodwill the original tenant had built over the years, without providing any benefit to the original business. In the course of the negotiation, I had to explain to my client the risks associated with agreeing to such a term. We carefully considered how this clause could impact their brand and whether it was worth taking the risk. After much deliberation, we were able to push back on the mall owner and successfully negotiate the removal of this provision from the lease. Ultimately, the client was able to secure a lease agreement that allowed them to maintain control over their brand and its use, even if they decided to move out of the space in the future. Story 2. As a German law student, I'm fortunate that our legal system provides strong protections when it comes to terms and conditions. Here, such contracts are tightly regulated, and anything too absurd or out of place is simply illegal. In German law, we have a concept known as surprising clauses, überraschende Klauseln, which refers to any term in a contract that a person wouldn't reasonably expect to find. If a clause falls under that category, it's automatically void. On top of this, there's a whole slew of other regulations that further protect consumers and individuals. Many clauses that might appear in contracts are outright forbidden by law. So, when I read through terms and conditions, it's often more amusing than worrying to see how poorly written or unenforceable some of them are. That said, I recently encountered a personal situation that was far from amusing. I inherited a small amount of assets, but those are currently under the control of an executor of the estate. Unfortunately, this means I don't have direct control over everything, particularly a company that's involved in the inheritance. I'm deeply interested in understanding what's going on with the company, especially its financials, and wanted to review the relevant documents. The executor, who also happens to be the CEO of that company, agreed to let me look at the documents, but only under the condition that I sign a confidentiality agreement. This wasn't too surprising, given the nature of the information. However, hidden within the confidentiality agreement was a clause that caught my attention, a liability exclusion clause. It essentially stated that if I discovered anything in the documents that implicated the executor or the company in any wrongdoing, I would be legally barred from using that information against them. This, of course, was unacceptable. The clause was clearly designed to shield the executor from any potential legal consequences should I uncover something untoward. I didn't need much time to decide. I refused to sign the agreement. It was a blatant attempt to limit my rights and to prevent me from holding the executor accountable for any misconduct that might be buried in those documents. Now, as you might expect, I'm currently locked in a legal battle with the executor. I'm challenging their attempt to prevent me from accessing the documents under fair and transparent terms. While it's frustrating to be in this situation, especially since it involves an inheritance that's rightfully mine, I'm confident that German law is on my side. The courts are strict when it comes to these kinds of overreaching clauses, and I intend to see this through to ensure my rights, and those of other potential beneficiaries, are fully protected. Story 3. Back in the 1960s through the 1980s, the lumber industry was rife with shady practices. Many contractors operated in a gray area, taking advantage of landowners who weren't familiar with the true value of their timber. One of the most common scams was for a contractor to offer a low price, say $5,000, for a landowner's timber. Then, a supposed competitor, often a co-worker disguised as a representative of another company, would come by a week or two later offering $20,000. The landowner, thinking this was a great deal, would accept the second offer without realizing their timber was actually worth twice that amount or more. However, my grandfather knew of a contractor who took these underhanded tactics to an entirely new level. This guy had perfected a scheme that exploited a clever loophole in his contracts, and he managed to scam dozens of people without facing serious repercussions. His contract would state that payment for the timber would be delivered once the last load of wood had been collected from the property. At first glance, the terms seemed straightforward, and many landowners didn't think twice about signing. But here's where the trick lay. The contractor never collected the last load of timber. Whether it was a small pile left behind intentionally or an entire load he conveniently forgot about, he always made sure there was something left on the property. Because the contract was so specific, stating that payment would only be made after the last load was removed, he never had to pay the full amount owed. Landowners, thinking they would get their money soon, would wait, but the payment never came. When people realized they'd been scammed and took the contractor to court, they lost almost every case. The contract's language was airtight, and legally, the contractor hadn't breached it. He always had a legal defense. I haven't taken the last load yet, so the contract isn't fulfilled. Even worse, most victims were too embarrassed to admit they'd fallen for such a scam. They didn't want their friends, family, or neighbors to know they'd been duped. Because of this shame and reluctance to speak out, the contractor was able to repeat his scam over and over again, targeting one unsuspecting landowner after another. He operated in multiple communities, knowing that word wouldn't spread fast enough to catch him. People remained silent out of fear of looking foolish, and that silence allowed him to continue preying on their neighbors. Story 4. I'm not a lawyer, but I once signed a non-compete agreement with a previous company that had some pretty restrictive conditions. It wasn't until I left the company that I fully realized just how far-reaching and burdensome the stipulations were. The agreement wasn't just your typical, "you can't work for a competitor" clause. It went way beyond that. According to the non-compete, if I left the company for any reason, whether I resigned, was laid off, or even got fired, I would be prohibited from working with any of the company's current or former clients. This included any company the business had provided services to, as well as any companies they had marketed to or targeted for potential business within the last 2 years. That alone covered a vast network of businesses, but it didn't stop there. On top of that, the agreement also restricted me geographically. I was barred from working within 75 miles of any of the company's clients or prospects. This meant that I couldn't just move on to work with another business in the same industry or even a related field if it fell within that radius. Given the fact that the company had clients and prospects scattered across a wide region, the restrictions covered a massive area. It was like having a professional no-go zone that followed me wherever their clients were, making it extremely difficult to find another job that wasn't somehow connected to their vast network. What made the situation even more challenging was that I hadn't realized just how limiting the agreement would be until I was out of the company. When I was job hunting, it felt like every other company I wanted to work for was somehow tangled up in the restrictions. Either they were on the company's client list, had been marketed to, or were located too close to one of those businesses. It was a frustrating experience to feel like I was boxed in by a document I had signed long before any of this even crossed my mind. At the time of signing, I hadn't fully appreciated the scope of what I was agreeing to. Non-compete agreements are fairly common in certain industries, but this one went beyond what I expected, essentially preventing me from working in the same field in the region for a significant amount of time. It felt less like protecting the company's legitimate business interests and more like trying to trap former employees from moving on. Story 5. I can't even pinpoint specific examples, but there are just so many situations where contracts are filled with blatant errors or nonsensical clauses. And what's surprising is that it's not always hidden in the fine print. It can be scattered right throughout the first drafts. I've seen cases where the language in the contract completely undermines the very purpose of the agreement, making you wonder if anyone involved in drafting it even stopped to think about what they were writing. For instance, there are clauses that mistakenly grant the wrong authority to the wrong people or entities, which can completely skew the balance of power in an agreement. You might see a contract where a party that shouldn't have decision-making authority suddenly has it, or where someone who needs protection is left unprotected. Sometimes, these contracts also include termination dates that are absurdly far into the future, creating obligations that last way longer than they should, often well beyond what was intended by either party. Another issue I've encountered is the absence of crucial protections or indemnities. It's shocking how often contracts are missing essential terms that would safeguard one party's interests, leaving them exposed to unnecessary risk. For example, you might have a situation where there's no indemnity clause to protect one party from being liable for certain types of damages, even though such a provision would normally be considered standard practice in that kind of agreement. Perhaps the most frustrating error is when the completion of a deal is tied to a condition precedent that is impossible to fulfill. It's one of those things that can easily go unnoticed during the drafting stage, but it can cause major problems down the road. If a contract states that something has to happen before the deal is finalized, but that something is literally impossible, the entire agreement could fall apart. Yet these types of conditions somehow make it into contracts all the time, often without anyone catching them until it's too late. What's worse is that many people simply aren't paying attention when they're reviewing or signing these contracts. Whether it's out of trust in the other party or just negligence, they miss these glaring issues, and the result is millions of contracts out there with nonsensical or unenforceable provisions. People sign on the dotted line, thinking everything's fine, only to later discover that the contract they agreed to is filled with flaws that could lead to serious complications. Story 6. I'm not a lawyer, but I had a funny experience during the application process for my current apartment. As part of the screening, they asked if any of the applicants had a medical marijuana card. If you did, you weren't eligible to live there. No exceptions. I couldn't help but find the situation a bit ironic, considering how the world has changed in recent years regarding marijuana use. It struck me as odd because medical marijuana is legal in many places, and one would assume there'd be some level of accommodation, especially for people who need it for health reasons. After moving in, I quickly realized how much of a joke that rule actually was. Despite the no medical marijuana stipulation, it didn't take long before I started noticing the unmistakable smell of weed wafting through the air. It's like half the complex enjoys lighting up, and no one seems too concerned about the rule. You can smell it as you walk through the halls or pass by balconies. So, even though they made a big deal about not accepting anyone with a medical marijuana card during the application process, it seems like they're turning a blind eye to the reality of what's happening in their good Christian apartment complex. It makes me laugh sometimes. How seriously they took the screening process only to have the very thing they tried to prevent be a regular part of daily life here. On a different note, I also run a personal blog, and while I'm not a legal expert, I've included some humorous terms and conditions that I'm not entirely sure would hold up in court. For example, one of my clauses says, if you're visiting my website, you agree to make an honest effort to stay out of people's way when they're on the go. It's meant to be a playful jab at those who read while walking around or blocking pathways, especially in busy places like the Empire State Building. It's not just for mobile device users either. It's supposed to apply to anyone who stumbles across my site, and I jokingly claim that it lasts indefinitely. While I doubt anyone would ever try to challenge these terms, it does make me wonder just how far you could take funny or odd clauses in terms and conditions before they become legally questionable. Either way, it's there for a laugh, and who knows, maybe someone will actually take it seriously and make an effort to be a bit more mindful the next time they're reading on the go. Story 7. I'm not a lawyer, but my dad is, and this story always cracks me up. It wasn't about fine print or legal technicalities, just one of those funny moments in his career. One day, my dad came home absolutely dying of laughter. He had just received a complaint from a potential client, which in itself was rare for him. He rarely gets complaints. But this one was particularly outlandish. The story goes like this. A guy had come to my dad, wanting him to take on a case. For whatever reason, my dad decided not to represent him, as sometimes happens in the legal profession. That's when things took a turn. The guy wasn't just upset. He was convinced that my dad's refusal to take his case would have serious, life-altering consequences. In his complaint letter, the man wrote that because my dad wouldn't take his case, he was now doomed. And the reasoning? He claimed that Donald Trump, who hadn't even been elected president yet, was going to personally fire my dad and ruin his career. Apparently, the guy had some convoluted idea that Trump had the power to blacklist my dad from the entire legal profession, and this would all happen because my dad didn't take his case. It was as if in his mind, Donald Trump was just sitting around, waiting to be notified of my dad's every decision, ready to bring the hammer down if the wrong one was made. My dad couldn't stop laughing about it. The sheer absurdity of it all was too much. The guy truly believed that by refusing him, my dad had made an enemy out of one of the most powerful people in the country, someone who hadn't even won the presidency yet. Story 8. In the vast world of legal agreements and technical jargon, one often expects to find monotonous, boilerplate language about liability, user restrictions, and compliance. Yet, buried in the lengthy terms and conditions of Amazon Web Services, AWS, there is a hidden gem that catches the eye for its peculiarity and humor. Specifically, in Section 57.10 of AWS's Acceptable Use Policy, which governs the use of their lumberyard materials, there is an unexpected clause related to the end of the world. The section begins predictably enough. It states that users must comply with AWS's broader acceptable use policy, with a special emphasis on the fact that their lumberyard materials, tools primarily used for game development, are not designed for use in any life-critical or safety-critical systems. In other words, you shouldn't rely on lumberyard for controlling medical equipment, operating self-driving cars, managing air traffic control systems, or supporting any other function where human lives depend on the system's flawless operation. After all, these tasks are far too risky for tools meant for video games. But then, nestled deep within the legalese, there's a twist that no one expects. AWS adds a fascinating caveat to the restriction. Should the world descend into chaos due to a viral infection that causes human corpses to reanimate, yes, zombies, the rule no longer applies. Specifically, the restriction on using lumberyard for life-critical systems will be lifted if the United States Centers for Disease Control, CDC, or its successor body, certifies that a widespread viral infection is causing the dead to rise, seeking to feast on human flesh, and ultimately threatening the collapse of civilization as we know it. In a sudden burst of creativity, AWS has inserted a zombie apocalypse scenario into an otherwise dry document. It's almost as if the legal team was having a bit of fun, allowing a moment of levity in the middle of all the seriousness. Of course, this is highly unlikely to ever come into play. After all, the concept of reanimated corpses seeking out human flesh is the stuff of fiction, not real-world policies. Yet it's amusing to think that in the event of a zombie outbreak, game developers might be legally allowed to repurpose AWS technology to keep humanity safe. It's these kinds of hidden surprises that remind us how even the most formal of documents can hold moments of whimsy. Amidst the strict regulations, rules, and disclaimers, the small clause offers a glimpse into the quirky side of legal writing, making it a favorite anecdote among those who've stumbled across it. So, in the event of a zombie apocalypse, you can take comfort in knowing that while civilization might be crumbling, at least AWS's lumberyard tools will be available to help fight back against the hordes of the undead. You never know when a game engine might come in handy to survive the end of the world. Story 9. One such moment occurred with a client of ours when we were reviewing a proposed contract for an IT project. Everything seemed standard at first, with sections covering deliverables, deadlines, and confidentiality. But then we stumbled across a rather peculiar clause that left us scratching our heads and laughing. The clause in question? It stated that once the workers finished their tasks for the day, they were to clean the office thoroughly. That's right. The contract required the workers to tidy up the space, ensuring it was spotless before leaving. At first glance, this might not seem too unusual, especially in industries like cleaning services or manual labor. But there was one glaring problem. We weren't hired to clean anything. We were hired to develop software. As an IT company, our workers are software developers, professionals who spend their days writing code, debugging programs, and building digital systems, not scrubbing floors or dusting desks. It was clear that something had gone awry in the drafting of the contract. Upon further investigation, we realized that the client had copied a template intended for an interior decoration or cleaning company. In their rush to get things moving, they hadn't fully customized the contract to reflect the work they were actually asking us to do. Once we pointed this out, the client was just as amused as we were. They admitted that they had taken a standard contract from a different type of service provider, figuring it would be easier to modify it for our IT services rather than starting from scratch. But in the process, they had left in a few remnants of the original template, like the expectation that the workers would clean the office at the end of each day. We all had a good laugh over the idea of our developers swapping out their keyboards for mops and brooms at the end of a long coding session. The client quickly revised the contract, removing any references to cleaning duties, and we moved forward with the project without any further complications. Story 10. One of the most common clauses found in contracts is something along the lines of, no agreements, written or oral, that are not stated in this agreement and signed by both parties shall be valid. It's a standard provision meant to ensure that only what's written and formally agreed upon holds legal weight. However, some people still rely on verbal agreements, not realizing the potential dangers of doing so. I once had a client who was about to buy a gas station, and they were relying on an oral agreement to verify some important financial details. The buyer had been told, verbally, that after signing the sales agreement, they would be allowed to look at the seller's financial records to confirm the station's income and profits. Essentially, they were agreeing to a major purchase without seeing the books first. The buyer asked me to review the agreement of sale, and when I read through it, I noticed there was no mention of this verbal agreement in the contract. I advised the buyer to have the oral proviso put in writing and signed by both parties before going any further. My reasoning was simple. Once the agreement was signed, there would be no legal obligation for the seller to show the books, and my client would be at a serious disadvantage if they discovered any discrepancies after the fact. I told them plainly, get it in writing or don't sign. I never heard from the buyer again. Maybe they walked away from the deal, or maybe they ignored my advice and signed anyway. Either way, it was a prime example of why everything, especially something as crucial as financial verification, needs to be spelled out in the contract. On the flip side, there was a time when I was on the other end of the table, drafting releases for a client of mine who regularly faced lawsuits or threats of legal action. To protect my client, I had a standard form that claimants would sign, agreeing to accept a cash settlement and release all claims against my client. In this release form, I also included a clause stating that the claimant would not take any further action or make any statements that could harm my client. But, in a bit of legal cleverness, I also added a provision that if my client suffered any damages as a result of the claimant's actions or claims, the claimant would be responsible for reimbursing those damages. It was a sneaky little clause, and only one lawyer ever caught it. When he asked me to remove it, I did so, but it was interesting to see how often people would sign without reading closely. In fact, this clause actually came into play once when a claimant had agreed to drop everything, but their mother wrote a letter of complaint to some relevant authority after the settlement. My client was worried that this could cause reputational harm or even financial damage. So I wrote a polite but firm letter to the claimant's lawyer, pointing out that if the mother's complaint resulted in any damages to my client, we would be expecting reimbursement, as outlined in the original release. That letter must have done the trick because the complaint vanished, and we never heard from the claimant or their family again. It just goes to show how important it is to read every detail of a contract. A single sentence can change the entire outcome of a deal, or in some cases, prevent a well-meaning mom from causing trouble. Story 11. In the world of rental agreements, tenants typically expect a straightforward contract outlining rent payments, maintenance responsibilities, and lease duration. However, occasionally, landlords attempt to slip in clauses that tip the balance of power heavily in their favor. I came across one such case where a landlord crafted a lease agreement that, on the surface, looked like a standard document. But upon closer inspection, it became clear that they were attempting to include provisions that could essentially give them the ability to evict tenants on a whim. The lease contained several separate segments that, when read individually, seemed harmless enough. First, it stated that the rent had to be received by the landlord on the first of the month, fairly standard. However, it also mentioned that any rent payment received even slightly late could be considered a violation of the lease. That raised a red flag. It wasn't just about charging a late fee. It was about turning a minor delay in payment into a serious breach of contract. The next part of the lease escalated things further. It stated that any violation of the lease, such as late rent, would grant the landlord the right to change the locks on the property, effectively denying the tenant access. This meant that if the rent was late by even a day, the landlord could lock the tenant out without notice, cutting them off from their own home and belongings. But the most egregious part of the lease came next. The landlord had inserted a clause that required the tenant to waive their right to remain in the property during any legal dispute. Essentially, if the tenant wanted to fight the lockout, they would have to take the landlord to court. But until the court case was resolved, the tenant would not be allowed back into the property. This meant that even if the tenant was ultimately in the right, they could be locked out of their home for weeks or months while waiting for a judgment. In the meantime, they'd have to find somewhere else to live, essentially forcing them to give up the fight out of sheer inconvenience. When you pieced it all together, the lease created a system where the landlord could claim they hadn't received rent on time, whether or not that was actually true, lock the tenant out, and keep their belongings hostage. The tenant, unable to access their own home, would have no choice but to find alternative housing while pursuing an expensive and time-consuming lawsuit. The landlord, in effect, had built in a way to evict anyone at any time, with very little recourse for the tenant. It was a classic case of a landlord trying to game the system by creating a legal way to kick tenants out whenever they wanted. Luckily, this kind of predatory clause wouldn't hold up in court, but many tenants, especially those unfamiliar with legal jargon, might not notice these details until it was too late. This situation serves as a stark reminder to always read the fine print in any contract, especially a lease, and to push back against anything that seems unfair or one-sided. The power imbalance between landlords and tenants can be significant, but with a careful eye and sometimes legal counsel, these sneaky tactics can be caught before they cause real harm. In this case, the tenant was lucky enough to spot the trap before signing, but it's a cautionary tale for anyone navigating the often complex world of rental agreements. Story 12. During my time as head of company relations for a career club at my university, I handled quite a few sponsorship deals. Most of them were pretty simple. Companies would pay us a set amount of money in exchange for hosting a few events for them on campus, giving them exposure to students and helping them recruit talent. We had a standard sponsorship agreement that we used for all our partners, which boiled down to a few key points. You pay us X amount, we organize these events on specific dates, and you can't bring any uninsured workers to the events. It was a pretty straightforward arrangement, and given that the amount we charged wasn't particularly high, most companies were more than happy to sign without fuss. That is, until one international cosmetics company came along and decided they wanted to sponsor us. At first, everything seemed normal. They were excited to participate, the budget was in line, and we had a few events lined up that matched their interests. But when they sent back the contract with their minor revisions, things took a bizarre turn. Instead of just agreeing to our standard terms, they had tacked on an additional 4 pages of legal clauses that went way beyond what any of us expected. These weren't just minor tweaks about event logistics or branding guidelines. No, these were serious restrictions. Among other things, their new clauses included language that would have prohibited not just our club, but the entire university from working with certain governments and industries for years after the deal was signed. The cosmetics company wanted to dictate who the university could and couldn't partner with across multiple sectors, and it wasn't even related to the events we were organizing for them. We were talking about restrictions that could have impacted other student clubs, academic departments, and even research partnerships at the institutional level. It was mind-boggling. Here we were, trying to set up a simple student career event, and this company was essentially trying to use it as leverage to influence the university's long-term relationships and partners. I immediately flagged this with the rest of the club's leadership and university administrators. None of us could believe how far-reaching these restrictions were for what was supposed to be a simple sponsorship agreement. We had been charging a relatively modest fee for the sponsorship, nothing that would justify the company trying to control university policy. In fact, had we signed the agreement without noticing these clauses, the fallout could have been disastrous, potentially limiting academic freedom and collaboration on a global scale. Naturally, we pushed back hard on the proposed changes, telling the company that we weren't comfortable with the additional clauses. Our events were about fostering connections between students and potential employers, not giving a corporate sponsor the power to interfere with the university's broader international relationships. After some back and forth, the cosmetics company tried to negotiate, but their insistence on maintaining some level of influence over the university's partnerships was non-negotiable for us. In the end, we had to walk away from the deal entirely. It was a strange and frustrating experience, but it taught us an important lesson about carefully reading every detail of a contract, no matter how routine it might seem. You can never predict when a seemingly straightforward agreement could hide deeper implications that could have major consequences. Story 13. Leases are meant to outline the rules and responsibilities between tenants and landlords, but sometimes landlords throw in some clauses that go far beyond the usual rent, maintenance, and property rules. My current apartment lease is a perfect example of this, as it essentially contains a clause that says tenants can't be mean to management. I'm not joking. The lease actually has a provision that goes beyond typical conduct expectations, bordering on an attempt to shield themselves from any criticism or complaints. To give you some context, the management at this complex has a terrible reputation. The building has been poorly maintained, and residents are frequently frustrated by their lack of responsiveness and unprofessional behavior. In fact, it's so bad that some of the current tenants have made it a habit to warn prospective renters during tours, telling them not to sign the lease because of how awful the management is. The internet reviews are no better. Nearly 100% of them are negative, painting a clear picture of the problems people have faced here. So it seems like management, tired of all the bad press, decided to slip a sort of anti-slander clause into the lease. At first glance, the provision seems like a restating of existing anti-slander and defamation laws, but it's framed in a way that feels overly broad and controlling. The clause says that tenants, occupants, and their guests may not disrupt or interfere with our business operations or communicate with us in a rude, hostile, or unreasonable manner. This part already feels subjective. What qualifies as rude or unreasonable is never clearly defined, and they go on to say that they are the sole judge of acceptable conduct. But that's not all. The lease also prohibits tenants from injuring our reputation by making bad faith allegations against us to others. In other words, they don't want anyone talking badly about them, and they're trying to make it a lease violation if you do. It was pretty clear that this was their way of trying to prevent more negative reviews or public complaints about their poor service. I'm no legal expert, but this clause felt like a serious overreach. I spent a lot of time looking into it before signing, and while I ultimately decided it was bad leasing practice, I still needed the apartment. In reality, this clause is almost impossible to enforce. Anti-slander laws already exist, and this kind of language in a lease doesn't override your legal rights. As long as you're telling the truth and can back up your claims with evidence, there's no legal basis for them to penalize you just for speaking out. And thankfully, I'm a pretty tenacious person. If I ever need to make a complaint about the management, whether in person or online, I'll make sure I have all the proof I need to back up any claims I make. If they try to pull something based on that clause, I'm confident it wouldn't hold up, especially since tenants are well within their rights to share their experiences, truthful experiences, about where they live. Still, it's wild that the management felt the need to add this kind of clause in the first place. It speaks volumes about their reputation and how desperate they are to control the narrative. Rather than focusing on improving their services and addressing the concerns of their residents, they chose to take the route of trying to stifle criticism. If anything, that just adds to the list of reasons why people shouldn't rent here. In the end, I signed the lease because I needed a place to live, but it's a cautionary tale about how far some landlords will go to protect themselves from bad reviews rather than just fixing the problems that are causing them in the first place. Story 14. This story takes me back to a peculiar contract I signed around 18 years ago when I was just 14 years old. A TV production company had approached our school, looking for a group of students to feature in a documentary they were producing about film censorship. The goal of the documentary was to show how many teenagers were watching movies with 15 or 18 age certifications, even though they technically weren't old enough to be doing so. For those unfamiliar with the UK system, these ratings are equivalent to R-rated movies in the United States. Naturally, we were all pretty excited. For those of us who were selected, it seemed like a fun adventure. The production company took us out to see a movie, covered our transport, treated us to dinner, and conducted interviews with us for the documentary. It was all quite the experience, especially for a group of 14-year-olds who had never been involved in something like this before. We felt like mini celebrities for a day, and the whole process was lighthearted and enjoyable. However, there was one part of the process that has stuck with me ever since, probably because it was so bizarre. Before we could participate, we had to sign release forms. Pretty standard stuff, as the company needed our permission to film us and use the footage. But as I was reading through the form, one particular clause caught my eye. It said that the production company, a major terrestrial broadcaster in the UK, would have the rights to use our images in perpetuity throughout the universe. Even at 14, this seemed ridiculous to me. The idea that this company could use our images forever, and not just within the UK, but across the entire universe, was both amusing and slightly unsettling. I remember thinking, what exactly do they plan to do with this footage in space? Is there a TV network on Mars I don't know about? To this day, it still makes me laugh to imagine a future where, if we ever colonize Mars or travel to distant planets, this documentary could be broadcast on some alien TV channel. And if that happens, they won't owe me a single penny in royalties because of this overly ambitious contract clause. Story 15. I once had a client who found himself in serious legal trouble after torrenting some illegal and highly sensitive material. The files he downloaded weren't just your typical pirated movies or music. They contained forbidden content, including illicit videos that had embedded forensic data linked directly to his account. This forensic key, hidden in the metadata of the files, was what ultimately led to his identification and arrest. Understandably, my client was desperate to avoid the public humiliation that would come with a trial, especially considering the nature of the material. Piracy, illegal pornography, and a sophisticated tracking software that had flagged. He was willing to settle the case quickly, hoping to keep it under wraps and move on with his life as quietly as possible. However, when the settlement agreement arrived, it contained a disturbing clause. The settlement had a confidentiality provision, but it was designed in a way that actually worked against my client. It allowed the company to use the details of his settlement in any future claims against other infringers. Their plan was to attach the settlement agreement to future cease and desist letters, using it as a warning to others about how much money previous offenders had been forced to pay to avoid court. In essence, they wanted to exploit my client's settlement as a tool to intimidate other potential infringers. The most shocking part? The company had sent us a redacted copy of a previous infringer's settlement agreement to show how they handled these cases. But their redaction job was sloppy, and all of the personal details of that previous infringer were still visible. It was appalling to see such a gross mishandling of sensitive information, especially considering the gravity of the case. It was clear they had no qualms about compromising privacy in order to win future battles. Story 16. I was in the process of setting up a new business in a different state when I came across a guy I knew who was doing similar work. We started talking about forming an LLC together, with the idea being that we'd split the profits evenly, 50/50ths. It seemed like a good opportunity, so we began discussing the details. Early on, though, there was a bit of a red flag. He insisted that we use his attorney for all the paperwork because, as he put it, he liked all the contracts to be the same. That seemed a little off, but I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Once I received the articles of formation, I was shocked. Buried in the legal language, there was a clause stating that he would receive 50% of everything I earned, not just in the new state, but in every state where I did business, from every LLC I operated. And this wasn't in exchange for any real services. It was framed as some bizarre management fee. The guy was essentially trying to take a massive cut of my entire business, not just the joint venture we had discussed. I called him up immediately and pointed out what I thought was an obvious mistake. I explained that I had no problem splitting the profits for the business we were starting together, but it made absolutely no sense for me to hand over half of all my earnings in every other state. I figured it was just a drafting error by his lawyer, but his response took me by surprise. "Oh, that's just legalese," he said. "I wouldn't do that to you. Just sign it, and we'll go with what we talked about. I'm not trying to steal from you." That wasn't good enough for me. I suggested that we have my attorney amend the articles to reflect what we had actually discussed. A simple 50/50th split for the joint business, with no claims on my other ventures. But as soon as I proposed this, he launched into an angry rant, mentioning how he was now in my business in my state, as if that gave him some right to a share of everything I earned. At that point, I realized this partnership wasn't going to work. I told him I didn't do business this way and hung up the phone. In the end, it became clear that he wasn't interested in a fair partnership. He was trying to pull a fast one and take a cut of everything I had worked for. So I walked away, calling out his shady tactics for what they were. Sometimes you've got to trust your gut when someone's trying to play you. Story 17. I'm not a lawyer, but I work for an agency that was once involved in taking enforcement action against someone. After a lengthy back and forth with the respondent's attorney, we managed to hammer out a settlement. Both sides eventually agreed that the individual would pay a fine of X dollars, along with any other terms negotiated as part of it. The terms were clear, and we thought everything was wrapped up. Once the settlement was finalized, our attorney prepared the official documents, which were sent to the respondent for signature. Standard procedure. Once they signed the documents, they were supposed to send them back along with the check for the agreed-upon penalty. All seemed routine at this point. A few days later, the documents come back, but something's off. The check included with the settlement isn't for the amount we agreed on. In fact, it's significantly less. Confused, we take a closer look at the paperwork and realize what the respondent had done. Before signing, he had gone through the agreement and crossed out every reference to the penalty we had negotiated, replacing it with a much smaller figure. He then signed it, assuming that by making those changes and adding his signature, it was official and he had successfully reduced the fine without any objections from our side. What he didn't seem to realize was that the settlement still needed to be signed by our agency in order for it to be legally binding. Just because he altered the document and signed it himself didn't mean it was final. Needless to say, we did not sign the altered document. The deal was off, and his attempt to manipulate the settlement backfired spectacularly. Story 17. One of my business law professors once shared a particularly troubling story from his legal practice that happened about 20 years ago. A man came to him seeking legal advice, desperate to get out of a business partnership that had turned into a nightmare. He had co-founded a company with two other partners, a husband and wife, who had turned the business into their personal piggy bank. While he stayed behind, working tirelessly to keep the business afloat, they were using company funds to travel across Europe, enjoying vacations and luxury, leaving him to shoulder the responsibilities and the mounting debt. The man was trapped. The business wasn't structured as a limited liability partnership, so if he walked away, he would still be personally liable for the company's debts, which had piled up into hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the worst part? The partnership agreement had a clause stating that no transfer of ownership could be made without a 2/3 majority vote. Since there were 3 partners, this meant he needed either the husband or the wife, preferably both, to agree to let him out of the partnership. But of course, why would they give up such a sweet deal? They were reaping all the benefits, leaving him to do the hard work and pay the price. There was no incentive for them to let him go, and they had him cornered. The man was hoping my professor could find a legal loophole or some way to break free of the partnership. But after reviewing the partnership agreement and the situation, my professor realized there was no easy way out. It was a grim situation. With the structure of the partnership and the 2/3 voting requirement, the man had virtually no power to leave on his own terms. Finally, my professor gave him advice that, while shocking, was the only realistic option under the circumstances: go pass away. In other words, The only way out of the crushing debt and this exploitative partnership was for him to exit the world entirely. There was no legal solution that could save him. After that, the man left the office, and my professor never saw him again. To this day, my professor doesn't know what became of him. It's a haunting story, one that highlights the dangers of entering into poorly structured partnerships without proper protections. It also serves as a sobering reminder of how legal entanglements can sometimes trap people in situations with no escape. Except perhaps the most final. Story 18. I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with my fair share of legal documents, around 3,000 contracts to be exact, during the 9 years I founded and ran a video game company. One of the more memorable experiences I had was when Epic Games approached us with a deal. At first glance, it seemed like a standard partnership offer, but when I dug deeper into the terms, I quickly realized there was a catch. Hidden in the contract was a clause that gave Epic the power to terminate the deal at any moment, without warning. And if they did terminate it, we would be banned from working with any of their clients, many of whom were already our clients. It was a ridiculous demand. My company had more clients than they did at the time, and signing that agreement would have given them control over who we could work with, potentially cutting us off from a large chunk of our existing business. I outright refused to sign, and when I pushed back, they refused to remove the clause. It became clear they were trying to strong-arm us into a deal that could have severely hurt our company. Fast forward 6 months, and Epic launched Epic China, a direct competitor to my business. They had been planning to enter our market all along, and if we had signed that contract, we would have been completely blindsided and shut out of the space. By not signing, we avoided what would have been a total market coup. Essentially, Epic was preparing to sweep the rug out from under us while trying to disguise it as a partnership. It's frustrating to think about how close we came to being trapped by that contract. Epic was gearing up to take over a market where we were already leading, and if we had gone along with their terms, we would have been shoved out of the game entirely. Even though they eventually bought out some of the major players in that space, it was clear that their tactics were more about control than collaboration. Looking back, I'm glad we didn't fall into their trap, but it still leaves a bad taste. Those guys may have bought their way to success, but to me, they'll always be remembered as cutthroat opportunists. Story 19. I'm not a lawyer yet, but this story about my mother's experience with a car dealership is a prime example of why you should always read before you sign anything. My mom, bless her heart, decided to buy a used van from a really shady dealership. The deal was labeled as is, but she didn't fully understand what that meant. The dealership wouldn't let her bring a mechanic to check the vehicle before she bought it, which should have been a massive red flag. They even refused to let her inspect the underside of the van herself. Despite all these warning signs, she went ahead and paid almost $4,000 for the van. After the purchase, she finally took the van to a mechanic, and that's when the real nightmare started. The entire underside of the van was rusted out beyond repair, and the suspension system was practically non-existent. It was in such bad shape that the mechanic was surprised the thing hadn't fallen apart on the drive over. My mom was furious, understandably, and tried to get her money back. She even reported the dealership to the state, hoping to get some justice for what she saw as an obvious scam. But here's where things took a turn. Despite her efforts, she didn't grasp what as-is actually meant. The dealership had made it clear, though maybe not in a way she fully understood, that once the sale was final, they weren't responsible for any issues. As-is means you're buying the car in whatever condition it's in, no matter how terrible it might be, and there's no legal obligation for them to take it back or offer repairs. So she was stuck with this van, and the dealership got off scot-free. Rather than cut her losses, my mom decided to sink more money into fixing the van, believing she could restore it to a decent condition. Over time, she put another $10,000 into repairs, but no matter what she did, it was a lost cause. The van continued to have problem after problem, and the more she fixed, the more issues seemed to pop up. To this day, it's still rattling with mechanical failures, and the whole ordeal could have been avoided if she had only understood the full implications of buying a car as is. The lesson here? Always read and fully understand a contract before signing it, especially when it comes to big purchases like cars. If something feels off, like not being allowed to inspect the vehicle, trust your gut and walk away.